Hi, Matthew.
How you doing, Bob?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm okay. It's I'm here in at the UN. It's a rainy Friday night in New York, and some would say it's a historic day in which Palestine has asked for UN membership.
Yep, and we appreciate you taking our time and once again being the Blogging Heads UN correspondent in a time of need. So it's late on the day in the evening, past the bedtime of many lesser reporters than you.
Wow.
And I gather you actually haven't had a bedtime in a couple of nights. It sounds like you've been working pretty much nonstop. But it's a big week at the UN.
Yeah, it's really been pretty wild over here. I mean, it's been it's not so much the speeches. I mean, I think some people, they definitely start at 9 in the morning and go till 9 at night. But it's more it's more a matter of I go to this it's like the North Lawn building where most of the diplomats hang out, and you get responses to speeches. You can I've been writing a lot about Libya, so you can really speak to a lot of different delegations. Plus, you just see, mostly they use that building to do like bilateral meetings between different countries. So today you had like Avigdor Lieberman like up and down storming around. You had the Sudanese coming through, Serbians. It's really a fruit salad.
And they have a screen there, so they are watching. They can watch the General Assembly proceedings. So they would have been watching Abbas's big speech today.
Yeah, they can. You know what? A lot of people. There's an area called the Vienna Cafe, which is like I guess it was funded by Austria, but it's.
I think I was there with you.
Exactly. It's where we went to that little. Exactly. They're selling like $5 sandwiches, and the soup price has gone up, by the way. But a lot of people have laptops, so I was actually listening on headphones, and then these two guys from the Malaysian delegation, like from Malaysia, not from the mission here, wanted to hear, so I took it off. Then I was trying to tweet it, so they were a little disconcerted because they wanted to see Abbas. But it was really, but those speeches really, and there's obviously the Netanyahu speech as well. Those were the event of the day, and then this triggered a series, a quartet meeting, stakeouts by Ashton, Hillary Clinton, the president of the Security Council. So I was expecting the day to be kind of a letdown in some way, and although nothing, I don't know, in a way nothing was accomplished, it definitely did. The boat got launched, and it got launched in style.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this right. So Abbas, in addition to delivering this big speech before Netanyahu delivered his, Abbas has kind of formally now filed for membership in the UN with the Security Council. There was some question what path he was going to take. He's going to Security Council, where he is pretty much assured of not succeeding because the U.S. will veto if it has to. It's going to try to possibly just delay for long enough to sidetrack the whole thing, maybe lure the Palestinians back into negotiations or something, or maybe round up enough either opposing or abstaining votes in the Security Council, which I guess would be 7 out of 15 would be needed to stop it, because you need a 9-vote majority, supermajority to pass it. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. And it might be more fun to go through all the procedural steps before we get to the predicted outcome. But I will say it's not at all clear to me that they have the 9 votes. I mean, I went to a press conference, I guess it was Wednesday. I mean, it's been it's weird because, it's been Palestine week, so there's been a lot of build-up to it. I talked to Hanan Ashrawi, longtime Palestinian advocate, just literally kind of on the fly by the East River, and asked her about one council member's vote.
I saw that on your site. You got video of you asking her questions.
Yeah, exactly. I literally was walking by the river, and she had just finished, I guess, Al Jazeera or something. They set up little tents outside. But I mean, the point is, you're absolutely right. In a way, although this has set off sort of shock waves, and I know Israel called it, a diplomatic tsunami, and the U.S. has been very focused on trying to kind of point out that even though they're prepared to use the veto, they're very committed to 2 states, except a 2-state solution. It's not, if there's not 9 votes, they don't even have to veto it. And the 9 votes that
is working hard to keep there from being 9 votes, right? I mean, there would be 9 votes in the ordinary course of events, but the U.S. is twisting arms, right?
Again, I only say this because I've kind of looked into it. The Palestinians, they sent a guy called Dr. Saf. He'd been here since 1974. Very, very articulate guy. His pitch was 9 members of the Security Council have, separately, before this move by Palestine, recognized the state of Palestine. So he would just assume, a priori, that would be their vote. The thing is, it's not that clear. The main one, and that's the one that I asked Hanan Ashrawi about, is Bosnia. Bosnia has, in the past, recognized Palestine, but right now, the political configuration in Bosnia is sort of like, there's 3 communities. Each of them sort of has a voice certainly on foreign policy, and any one of the 3 can essentially veto this kind of an action. And from I heard this actually from I don't want to source it, but I'd heard this earlier that there's a problem in Bosnia that the Bosnian Serb entity, it's called the Republika Srpska, which is not
Muslim, presumably.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, they're quite anti-Muslim. And I mean, right. There's been some dark allegations of kind of business with Israel, but basically, in the same way that during the Balkan Wars, it was kind of like the Bosnian Muslims got a lot of help from outside from Muslims. The Serbs are viewed as fighting extremism, and so it makes it very difficult. What I heard is that Bosnia would vote for Palestine in the General Assembly because it's kind of a no-brainer. 130 countries are doing it, but the Security Council vote is much more important. And it's not clear to me who would actually bring from the side of the pro-Palestinian side, bring pressure to bear on Republika Srpska to not block it. Then you have two other shaky countries, believe it or not, and these are kind of. Maybe it's because one is Gabon, which is very close to France and now to the U.S. And Nigeria, people are saying, may not be as strong a vote. So
and is the U.S. applying pressure so far as you can tell, or is it not?
I really can't say I've seen it here. I've heard that, and the Palestinians, both Hanan Ashrawi and the other guy, said, "Oh yes, they're blackmailing, they're doing this and that." The point is, even with the Bosnian one, they're down to 8 votes. Again, I'm not sure. I sort of, as a journalist, I kind of hope the thing plays out. And I guess to get to the factual part is that the paper was turned in by Abbas to Ban Ki-moon in the morning before the speech. Thus, he could announce in his speech, "I've turned it in." Some people thought, and I was, that Ban Ki-moon would try to find some way to hold on to the piece of paper, but he didn't. He actually, by the afternoon, mid-afternoon, he announced that he transmitted it to the president of the council, which is Lebanon, for the month of September. And literally by 3:30. The president of the Council of Lebanon held a stakeout and said, "I've spoken to members, I've circulated it, and we're going to have consultations, closed-door meeting on it Monday at 3 p.m.
So is this sounding like it's not going to go down a lot of bureaucratic, labyrinthine hallways, and you're saying this may come to a vote in the Security Council pretty fast?
I guess what I'm saying is everything that they could do today in terms of setting up a consultation on pretty much the next business day is done. Since then, I mean, again, this is all, I don't mean to just... I mean, the question is this: even the proponent,
they still can refer it to committee, and that can take forever or something.
Oh no, exactly. There is a committee. I mean, since I've been here, the only state I saw created was South Sudan, and it took place in all of a day, basically. It doesn't take. I mean, if they want, I think the real question here is that even the proponents. I mean, I think that if the let's say the Palestinians and those much in support of them, if they had the 9 votes and there was only the U.S. veto, I think they'd call a vote very quickly. Seriously. I think it'd be foolish if you don't have the 9 votes. It only decreases their leverage to call a vote and show 6 or 8. So I think it's kind of, and the real talk. I mean, I think that the kind of, and I don't really know how much to make of this, but as soon as it was turned in and Ban Ki-moon transmitted it, there was an emergency meeting of this, the Middle East Quartet, right, which is the UN, the EU, the U.S., and Russia. And Hillary Clinton came, and Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was here. And they met up, upstairs in Ban Ki-moon's office and issued this statement, laying down what they said, without really saying that the process in the Security Council. I guess they're saying it should stop, and they laid forth something in a month, something in 3 months, something in 6 months. They were asked, have the Palestinians agreed to this, and it doesn't seem that they have. So I think in that consultation Monday, I spoke to one of the European members of the Council this very evening before doing this, and they said, they're going to argue strongly that it shouldn't be dismissed in the Council, but it shouldn't move forward. The focus should be on negotiations. It's kind of like all this hoopla today was just a kind of, the Palestinians had said they would do it, so they had to do it. Now it's there, and it's kind of, there's the one thing we haven't talked about, which is the General Assembly. But I'll
right, well, let's sketch it out, okay? But just the possible pathways, okay?
Yep.
I mean, kind of nobody really expected the thing to pass in the Security Council. The question is, does it wind up in the General Assembly where you could get, if you don't go through the Security Council and wind up in the General Assembly, Palestine could wind up getting a kind of a milder affirmation of statehood in a sense, right? What is it, observer status at the UN?
Yeah, they're already an observer, but they would be bumped up. Right now they're like an observer entity. They'd be bumped up to the idea of an observer state.
Okay,
and the significance of that would be that,
statehood. And the Palestinian argument is that this would permit them to use various fora of international law, like possibly take Israel to the International Criminal Court, and so on, in addition to the less tangible things it might do by way of, energizing, say, the boycott movement in Europe or whatever. There's various intangible effects, but the main tangible one would be apparently this would give Palestine more standing to pursue grievances against Israel in international tribunals. And there's kind of two ways that it could, well, here's my question. I mean,
sure,
there's actually one way it could wind up in the General Assembly in principle, and they could wind up getting something stronger out of the GA, and that is if the U.S. vetoes and the Palestinians invoke this, what is it, the United for Peace thing? Uniting for, it's a long story, but basically it's a precedent that the U.S. set in the UN back during the Korean War when Russia was the obstacle and the perennial vetoer, and we kind of set a precedent that, well, if you've got somebody who's just vetoing everything, then you're allowed, there's a procedure by which you're allowed to go to the GA, and it becomes a kind of replacement in a way for, and you have all the standing you would if the Security Council had referred it to the GA.
I actually don't, again, it's weird. The weird thing is also, like, people always talk about, the international law and the law of the UN. It's not really clear what court you'd go to prove what the law is.
Right.
But I'm not convinced that you can become, the distinction here is like the GA could make Palestine a non-member state, declare them a state, an observer state, and then the argument is as a state they can join the ICC. You don't have to be a UN member to join the ICC, and the proof of that is Switzerland, which joined the ICC before they joined the UN, and Cook Islands as well. I've been trying to look into it. So there's definitely, all of these things, it's hard to really know. I don't really consider something law unless there's a court that can adjudicate it. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, but of course the whole thing with international law is that's kind of, it's in evolution. It's in the process of congealing, and it's still a little bit of a mess. So that's why people have arguments about things, and there may be no ultimate arbiter. And ultimately the question will be, if they bring a case to the ICC and the ICC accepts it, well, the precedent has been set, right?
Right.
So, but anyway, I think, I suspect that the kind of arcane procedure I just outlined, which would be an attempt to go to the GA and preserve some of the force you would get from the Security Council, and possibly they might argue that they really could get full membership in the UN that way. I suspect that's not going to happen. I suspect if they get thwarted in the Security Council, they will just go to the GA looking for this non-member state status. And is it your sense that they fully intend to do that if thwarted in the Security Council? Or
yeah, I wish, usually when we talk about things, I'm much more solid than this. This one is, it's hard to know. It seems like, because frankly, although it would be nice, joining the ICC would be another step down the road. None of these things, including even, let's say somehow the United States slept that day and didn't cast a veto. It's almost like the idea of property being like a bundle of rights and how much do you have. Even if you were a UN member, if you don't actually control your border, right? And Israel can stop people from immigrating from Gaza to the West Bank or vice versa, and a whole variety of things, it's not really clear, in and of itself, what do these two legal statuses mean? So I think the idea is that they're going to try to use this process, whether it's a 2-week process or a 2-month process or a 6-month process, as to try to gain leverage to get a better negotiation. From what Netanyahu said in his speech, it's very hard to imagine a negotiation that the Palestinians are going to be happy with.
I'll tell you, I was in Israel a few weeks ago. I was also in the West Bank. I was in Ramallah, and the sense among the Israelis I talked to is there's just no way, two-state is going to happen under this government. That Netanyahu doesn't want it. Any negotiations will be a sham. It's not going to happen. And I think, honestly, this last-ditch quartet effort to get it back to negotiation is largely an attempt by the United States to avoid having to cast a veto. But tell me something. Have you heard this? The kind of, I guess, conspiracy theory may not be quite the right term, but the cynical reading of what Abbas did. There had been the question: will he go to the Security Council and go for the whole enchilada, or will he just go to the General Assembly and get this milder affirmation? And when he went to the Security Council, everybody said, whoa, the guy is like taking off the gloves. This is serious. Now, I've heard the alternative theory, which is that at the Security Council, the thing can get sidetracked long enough for them to get drawn back into negotiations, and for his own reasons, he would actually prefer that outcome. Have you heard any of that?
Yeah, I think I think it's true. It's absolutely true that once it's in the GA, you have a lot more cooks. and people were going to push for speed. Whereas in the Security Council, they could always blame. They could say, oh, the U.S. and those Europeans, they're the ones bottling it up. So that's the whole. There is definitely an element of. I mean, the weird thing is, it's like with them filing today. The more you promise, you have to deliver something, right? So at a certain point, if it gets bottled up in the Security Council, every day the journalists, because this has become the big thing here. I mean, I'm trying. There's obviously there's Libya, there's Sudan, which is going to hell in a handbasket. There's a lot of other agenda items, but it's hard for me to believe that the council would be able to, in a kind of a, there may be precedents in the past of just sort of sitting on things for months, but here I'm not sure that would make them go faster, but it would become a daily. What exactly is the blockage? So I mean, I get it. It's easier to block it in an untransparent way in the council, where you have only 15 members, and you can sort of blame the U.S. Once it's in the GA, and as you know, the GA is this year the president is the former Perm Rep of Qatar, who's I would say very much in favor of the statehood bid. It'd be hard for him to explain I'm bottling it up, Whereas the council changes month to month, and
I think if it goes to the GA, it just passes and that's it. I mean that's the source of this kind of cynical theory that. For whatever reason, whether Abbas is himself concerned about I don't know. It's just a crackpot theory.
This is why I was distracted. One, because some other journalists were leaving. You were saying I'm the only one here. There's actually quite a few people here. But the other thing is you have this issue of Hamas and Gaza. I mean, this has come up a lot during this week. Like, I mean, the sort of the people that are very dismissive of the statehood move would say, how can you even ask for statehood when you don't even control, when you have a split where you have Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, and you also don't have. I asked this PLO or Palestinian Authority Fatah representative, what about Hamas? Hamas is not in favor of this bid. They've actually spoken against it. Right. So it's really it's a little. I think a lot of the proponents are trying to sort of sweep that under the carpet, or sort of by asking that you're somehow like trying to undermine it. But it is really a question of what even it would mean on the ground. You have to, and some of it you have to say, like, is it posturing, by Fatah to say, we're the ones out there in the world trying to get things for our people, and because the guy from that was here speaking from Ramallah, he was asked directly, actually by an anti-Palestinian questioner, I'll characterize her as, whether there were any Hamas people in their delegation here, and he said, well, we're not required. She said, that's an unfair question. We're not required to have people in other political parties. No one asks other governments that. But I think the way he answered it, she also asked the size of the delegation, which is always interesting, of like how many people came and how much is it costing. But I mean, that's another issue. But I think, as with every speech that's given here, a lot of it's for home consumption. You know what I mean? Like Obama's talked about talked about his jobs bill in the GA. He's obviously not going to get a vote on it there. I think Netanyahu, a lot of people said his speech today was pretty combative. It was a kind of thing. It was one of those, and I definitely read some of the sort of UN bashers who say, like, peacekeepers are doing rape in the Congo, and there was oil for food, but it was it was strange. What people said is, like, if you're there trying to sort of make your case in the GA, why would you just... And the sort of cherry on the sundae is, he said, this month the council is run by Hezbollah, meaning Lebanon.
Yeah. Well, don't you think, for Netanyahu, I think he's kind of given up on swaying the General Assembly, and it is largely for home consumption. Whereas with Abbas, I haven't seen all of his speech. I haven't seen all of either speech. I've TiVo'd Abbas and I've watched, 20, 30 minutes. You get a sense that there's a mixture. There's stuff that is clearly for the home audience, the apartheid wall, and for some people in the GA who would be sympathetic. But then there's this stuff about, we're still going to be open to negotiations with Israel, and this is not threatening, and blah, blah, blah. So I think Netanyahu's was mainly a home consumption thing. So how did the speech seem to go over there?
The Abbas speech went over big time. I mean, there was in the hall, there was applause. In the Vienna Cafe area, there were people saying this is great. I mean, I think that people actually thought he's not exactly always the best speaker. That they were pretty impressed by it. You've got a lot of, usually they'll say, let's not have any applause lines, but there was a lot of applause. This was it was a real kind of a climax for them, and the Netanyahu speech obviously didn't the only obviously the Israelis didn't walk out, as people did walk out on Ahmadinejad the day before, but both they and Susan Rice of the U.S., who was in the seat during the Abbas speech, looked pretty glum. Like there literally was like a standing ovation where everyone got up and They stayed there, but they didn't walk out. To the correct.
Don't you think this is hard on Susan Rice, the U.S. ambassador to the UN? I mean, is there, do you think there's any doubt that her heart is with the Palestinians on this?
I don't know. I mean, I see, because I see what she actually does. I mean, I guess if you want to have that job, you have to do what American foreign policy is. But she definitely can deliver I mean, I'll give you an example. The last time, and actually the U.S. was either maneuvered or mismaneuvered itself on the settlements resolution. You remember that one on the condemning settlements, where the U.S. did veto it.
We vetoed. It declared the settlements illegal, and we vetoed that.
And I think, maybe, I mean, again, people try to read into it and say, Susan Rice, she was sort of doing it half-heartedly. But she was, I mean, I was on a conference call with her right after they did the veto and asked, why have you taken off the table this idea of a Security Council trip to the Middle East? And she was like, it was a package deal. I mean, she was I guess she felt kind of almost offended that she'd been forced to veto. So it's not, that could actually make them even more vehement, in terms of So I don't really know what it means to say what the individual ambassador's view. I mean, I'm trying to think. I tried today to ask, or this was late last night, that the Australian Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd did a stakeout at like 10 p.m. With mostly for the traveling Australian press, and he recently had a heart attack, so that was their excuse of why he came so late. There was a lot of things going on with it. But in that country, there seems to be a split where the current Prime Minister Gillard wants to vote against the Palestinian bid, saying that negotiation is the only way. He would like to abstain, and then you have a former Australian, Garth Evans, who would say they should vote yes. But even whenever you try to, when he got pushed on that, he said, "I work for the Prime Minister." So it's not. I'm not sure what's gained by saying like that. Is Susan Rice more pro-Palestinian than Obama? I mean, I don't know. They do what they do, and they vote as they vote as they vote. What I have to, and I'm sorry it's not to change the topic, but I have to say this, and maybe some people have said I'm naive, but last year Obama came to the UN. There was a high-level meeting on Sudan. It wasn't just about South Sudan either. They talked about Darfur. They talked about genocide. And although South Sudan is now independent and joined, and everyone sort of clapped for them, the things are really bad in Sudan. I mean, everyone was saying in the run-up to the GA that Khartoum is bombing southern Kordofan and Blue Nile State. There's no humanitarian access. It's basically, and there's not a peep out of the U.S. delegation on this issue. In fact, Obama's speech talked about Sudan only in order to say, look at the support we gave to South Sudan. It shows that we like new states.
We like some new states. Yeah. So with Obama's speech, was there a sense? The New York Times kind of played this angle in its coverage of it. A sense that this was a watershed, that the U.S. was kind of beginning to marginalize itself in the conversation about Israel-Palestine. That we were seeing it cede influence, as a result of many things, the Arab Spring, the emergence of Turkey, and then, yes, Sarkozy stepping up to the podium after Obama and saying, look, let's at least, take this thing to the GA, the General Assembly, and let's do it, And Sarkozy basically, did he say explicitly, let's face it, negotiations aren't going anywhere, whereas Obama had just said we must have negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're part of the EU and the Quartet, which is saying that negotiations should be. But I think that it's almost like he was allowed to be, and the Quartet statement very much tracks what he proposed. What I've heard is also that, and this is maybe it's looking for trouble, is that behind the scenes they're saying, yes, we will support you in the GA, but we'd like a commitment from Palestine not to join the ICC, or if you join the ICC, not to refer Israel.
Wait, who is saying that behind the scenes?
That's I believe you're going to see I was talking to these anyway, that there's a discussion behind the scenes that, because obviously what Israel is most afraid of in the GA thing is just what you were saying before, joining the ICC. That the push is on to say if you really want full 27 EU members supporting you, there needs to be some understanding of what would happen in terms of the ICC. And that this is very inconsistent with the position that France and others took. For example, they referred Omar al-Bashir of Sudan to the ICC and have said there's no way to even suspend that. They referred Gaddafi. Now they're sort of, it's not clear if the Libyan, the TNC, would want to send him to The Hague anyway. But that there's something that France is taking the lead, but it's also I've gone to various things of Juppé and all this. It's a kind of a murky. You can't. I wouldn't take what he said in his speech as the final word.
But would you also suspect that if the EU is pressing for this kind of safeguard for Israel, that itself might be under American pressure? I mean, when we were in Israel, you think so?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I think they're definitely coordinating. There's not a huge split, between them.
Well, yeah, but on the other hand, the kind of consensus documents they hammer out in order to keep, that have no split, that they do agree with, are not very meaningful, right? Like the quartet. The quartet has issued this statement that ostensibly is an alternative to this statehood bid, right? That would draw them back to negotiations. But in my kind of quick reading of the news accounts about it, it just doesn't amount to much. I mean, why would you expect the Palestinians, from the point of view of the Palestinians, there's nothing new in the quartet document, right?
Absolutely.
There's no Israel agreeing to stop the settlements or anything.
Nope, there isn't, exactly. There's just a time frame and the idea that now, Lady Ashton will be paying more attention, which is, And
when I was in Israel a few weeks ago, we had an evening with EU officials, and my sense is that their actual opinion is that they're totally fed up with Israel. And that, of course, these are the bureaucrats, of course. These are not the politicians who ultimately call the shots and are sensitive to public opinion and everything else. But that's the reason I tend to guess that to the extent that the EU is putting any kind of pressure on the Palestinians, it's as a result of American pressure. But what do I know?
Although, this is sort of this may seem a more marginal one, but for example, also this week there was this thing called the Durban 3 Review Conference, right? Which was a third time for reviewing this conference that took place right before 9/11 in 2001, which I wasn't there, so I can't, but I've heard it descended into virulent anti-Semitism, and so Israel has very much had been asking countries to boycott this one-day review conference that took place this week. And, Canada did very early on. The U.S. then admitted, and I actually asked Susan Rice about it once. I was like, are you boycotting? She's like, no, it's called non-participation. Because, it's basically a conference about reviewing, anti-discrimination. So I think the U.S., they really wanted to say, we like the idea, we just don't like how it's being implemented. But as it got closer, then Netherlands and Italy and some of the countries that are viewed as being, it's weird that it would sort of mean the same thing. They're viewed as being either slightly more to the right or slightly more pro-Israel. Started boycotting, and in the last stages, France did boycott as well. So there's obviously some. I wouldn't. There's a sensitivity to the position of Israel there. It just took a little bit longer. In fact, you could almost judge a country's where they stand on that issue by sort of when they decided to boycott. As it turned out, and again, there's so many things going on here this week. I don't want to say that the Durban thing wasn't a big deal, but you could be at the UN covering things and not even be aware of it. You have these kind of parallel worlds where people will take over. There was a 1 hour in the General Assembly, and then it disappears into these side rooms. Tonight there was something of the Ecuadorian President Correa having a meeting about this kind of, I don't want to call it ecological blackmail, but the idea of pay us so we don't drill in the rainforest. And they did this. There's sort of anyone can do whatever. The GA is like a circus, and so you can. I went to the Clinton Global Initiative, which is held at the same time as the UN across town on 7th Avenue, and it's like a parallel universe where the food is better, the Wi-Fi is faster, but. It's also because the real problems, you're not dealing with Somalia or Eritrea over there. You're dealing with kind of how do we prepare for disasters? And you end up with glowing speeches by, Dell Computers and Barclays and, it was a total corporate fest, but it's so weird how the UN does it, where it's and in a way, I said there was a lot of press coverage over there.
But the Clinton Initiative is a totally separate non-UN thing, right?
It's a non-UN thing, but I'm saying it's not by coincidence it's done exactly the same days, right?
No.
And it's not by coincidence that President Martelli of Haiti went. And actually, the funny thing is that the president of Sri Lanka, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who's allegedly a war criminal, according to a UN or Ban Ki-moon panel of experts report, his government engaged in war crimes. He hasn't yet met the Secretary General, in part, I believe, because of these pressures. But he showed up at the Clinton Global Initiative and snapped his picture with Bill Clinton. So it's kind of I haven't yet. I sort of went and spoofed it as an anti-corporate, as a corporation's gone wild. But I think that there is it is a kind of alternative UN with an army of interns and volunteers. The press is much better behaved over there in the sense that you have to go in through a side entrance. You're allowed to cover the events but not ask questions. Like I raised my hand and they said, no, the press isn't invited to participate in this Q&A.
Of course, one of the bigger stories that the press got out of that was Bill Clinton's apparent rebuke of Netanyahu, right? At least it was interpreted that way. Did you read those stories?
Yes, I did. I did see that. So I guess it does. Yeah, it does. It can make news, and it's a kind of an alternative bully pulpit. There was also a fun. I mean, I'm sorry to get into these kind of. There was a kind of the new Japanese Prime Minister Noda. Or actually, the new foreign minister is called Gemba. He works for Noda. He met with Hillary Clinton, and in a Japanese way, he wanted to give a gift. So the gift he gave was a picture of himself with Bill Clinton when he was governor of Arkansas. This is 24 years ago, and he gave it. And at least one newspaper, the Daily Mail, said this was like horrified Hillary Clinton, that she thought it was like conflating she and her husband. I mean, it is kind of weird to be in New York where you have like Clinton, Hillary Clinton moving around with an army of black vehicles with the government behind her, and Bill Clinton, like he's kind of like almost like a preacher over there. Like the event that I went to over there, he then appeared at the end with his these kind of reading glasses on and saying, "Deloitte and Touche, I want you to come up, like get up and walk." And you have it just was, no, it really was, I don't know, it's not to be a cynic.
He's got that in him for sure. I mean, his Southern Baptist upbringing really shows in his oratorical skills, I've always thought. He's good.
But to turn it, when he was president, he would put that, say, for working people, factory workers are getting screwed. When you turn that kind of down-home, homespun charisma to the benefit of the largest banks in the world, and I have to say this, not to be a cynic, but I don't know if, like, Tom Golisano, here in New York, I'm not saying he's a bad person, but he's a kind of a shadowy, Buffalo-based businessman. That I remember as being sort of the supporter of the New Alliance Party and Lenara Fulani, and I don't want to get into, like it's like talking about Scientology or something, but it was very weird to see this name at the top. It's like a co-sponsor. It sort of seemed like Clinton is just like, and then all these corporations, Swiss Re, it was just a corporate grab bag. And this is sort of a more serious point, is that it's not that Clinton, he may well be a good preacher and have his heart in the right place, but like on Haiti, I'm not convinced that his involvement, and even the UN's recent involvement in Haiti, has been a good thing. I mean, you have the scandal, not just of 4 Uruguayan peacekeepers on tape, either raping or mock raping a Haitian, boy, but you have they had the cholera was spread, which obviously wasn't intentional, but there's been no, kind of apology by the UN. There's been no, I don't want to say reparations, but it seems like, if Coca-Cola, or Tylenol brought a disease into a country, they'd have to pay something. You know what I mean? So it just seems like and Clinton is in a position where he could say the UN needs him there. He sort of gives them a higher profile. He could be advocating, and instead he's basically praising, Carnival Cruise Lines for going in and Digicel.
But it's funny. I mean, as for the corporations, he's got this foundation, and I'm sure some of this is about fundraising. But what you're saying is, hey, he's got this. He could use some political capital and actually speak some truth to power. When I saw the headline of this story about him rebuking Netanyahu, I said, God bless him. I so often think about these, these older former politicians and, like, when are they going to use their political capital?
Sure.
And in fact, I could go on all day naming politicians whom, you hear off the record, they're fed up specifically with Netanyahu. But they never kind of say it because they don't want to antagonize whoever. And I thought, well, Bill Clinton, finally using up a little political capital. Now, when I read what he said, it looked like he, it was a little milder than an explicit rebuke of Netanyahu, although the implication was clear. I mean, he basically said, things started going downhill when, he said it was a tragedy that Rabin was shot, which it certainly was. That Sharon isn't here. And then he said something obliquely dismissive or critical of Netanyahu. But it wasn't all that full-throated. But look, it's more than...
You must like Jimmy Carter then, right? I mean, Jimmy Carter really called it like he saw it.
I think Jimmy Carter, whatever you think of him and however ineffectual he may have been as a president, I think he's a very, very courageous guy, totally. I mean, he is he is a morally driven person. I think he's religious in the best sense. He's I think he really is religious. He really believes that that you should serve God, and he sees serving God as among other things speaking truth to power. And he's gotten into a lot of trouble for it.
I'm going to praise another religious man I saw here this week, which was Desmond Tutu. He was at this event called Every Woman, Every Child, which was it had 50 Cent. 50 Cent is selling a vitamin water and donating money to WFP. It was a very weird event. Deepak Chopra. This is I think I'm just trying to give you a flavor of the kind of the circus around it. And I sort of I felt uncomfortable. One day I went and just wrote like 4 negative spoof stories because it was all just kind of too much. But Desmond Tutu showed up and he said, I would like the audience here to put the same effort into opposing, forced marriage of young girls as they did into fighting apartheid. And I thought it really seemed to come from the heart. And the guy, he's obviously getting on in years, and yet there he was, So it's sort of that was one I have to say I was pretty taken with that.
There are good people in the world. Listen, it's past my bedtime. I should go. But just kind of in closing, am I?
I'm going to tell you one thing about Libya, if you don't mind.
Okay,
I just want to, but it's okay. Go ahead.
Give us a Libya riff.
No, I don't know if it's a riff. As to say, I was sort of surprised. Everything sort of moved at the end much faster, I think, than people thought it would. With the TNC, the Transitional National Council taking over city after city. The UN side of it really ended up being kind of interesting, and I think it's still interesting, which is that suddenly, the countries that were on the council that abstained but were dubious of NATO's role, turning, what at the time of the siege of Benghazi was really step in with airstrikes or the threat of airstrikes and protect those people. It turned into totally, very openly a campaign of let's change the government.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's still, I think, without getting on board with South Africa and India and other skeptics of it, it is a little strange when under a protection of civilians mandate, one, they bombed state television. Well, they said it was like the Rwanda radio station, but it seemed like they started bombing his house. Yeah. And now, clearly Gaddafi is lost. I mean, he hasn't yet been killed or captured, but it's not at all clear to me that he's killing civilians right now.
Right.
NATO is still bombing. NATO is still doing targeted airstrikes.
Moreover, I think there's a significant chance that the forces those airstrikes are supporting, I gather, are still surrounding the town of Sirte or whatever.
The guy Mohammed Jibril was here today and did a press conference, and he said that he predicts that Sirte will. He said the south has been fully liberated. He predicts that Sirte will fall in 48 hours, and Bani Wali, he said, it's under siege. We are squeezing it. Which, again, I guess it all depends which side you're on. But he didn't say, they're vermin. But when you say, we've laid siege and we're squeezing it.
Now, I'm sure that the killing is not nearly as indiscriminate as what Gaddafi was preparing to do to Benghazi at the time of the intervention. But there is the irony that, under authorization of the UN on grounds of protecting civilians, they are now bombing in support of troops that I would suspect are going to wind up killing a few civilians in closing this thing down. And look, I agree that there are people who argue that technically they're justified by any means necessary part of the authorization about protecting civilians. My own belief is that it's abusive. It's that they did change the mission, and in the long term, it does not serve the interests of the United Nations and the evolution of respect for international law and respect for the United Nations to pull a bait and switch like that. That's my view.
Totally. And I think I'm always looking more. I mean, I don't sort of either cover NATO or I don't know how they make their decisions, but I do in terms of the UN. The UN, let's say the Secretariat, the reason, and I think it's kind of important, when they passed that resolution in 1973, these roles were given to the Secretary General. He was supposed to be given notice of every action taken to protect civilians, every action taken to enforce the no-fly zone. It was kind of like, this is going to be legitimate because, look, we've got the UN involved. And as time went on, it was like, he's not coordinating, he's not getting notices. And the real problem that you have is that I ended up, and this is where the horn tooting comes in, but I can't resist it.
Go ahead.
And I ended up in late August through kind of disgruntled UN people working for the UN. Getting this document, which was the UN's plan for Libya, the post-conflict plan of Ian Martin, who's just been named the Special Representative of the Secretary General. I'm jokingly calling him, the Paul Bremer of Libya. But his plan, and it wasn't a draft plan. It wasn't like his bedside notes. It was a final plan created with the help of this professor, Dirk van der Waal, very respected, that he hired as well. Said, had a line in it that NATO will have a continuing role. And it proposed, sending in 200 military advisors. It was a very hooked-up plan, but what not only the naysayers on the council, but even some longtime UN diplomats have said is it's totally inappropriate for the UN to sit in New York kind of coming up with these plans. And once it got leaked, like I got it, I published it, there was a kind of at least a couple-day kerfuffle around it. I know the NTC people saw it and said, we don't want military help from the UN. But it's ended up, and this is where I'm sort of going with it, beyond the leak, is that I think that well-meaning people think, well, the UN should take the lead in Libya, so it's not just a sort of grab bag of Sarkozy and, Cameron and people that did the bombing trying to grab the spoils. But the UN has its own conflict of interest, which is it so desperately wants to be central or relevant in Libya that I don't think they're going to criminize the NTC if these civilians are killed in Bani Walid, right? Or I interviewed Idris Deby, who I'm sure people think is himself has a lot of problems. He's the president of Chad, but he said that the number seems high, 400,000 Chadians in Libya, and that many of them are falsely accused of being mercenaries, locked up without any due process. Right. And I think that's probably true. But I can imagine the UN, in a case where it's trying to get in a mission, it's going to go soft. It's going to go soft and sort of
Going to get tough to get a hearing or get justice from the UN because the UN wants to spin this as a victory. I assume that, of course, the UN's not a monolithic thing. I assume that Security Council members like Russia, on the other hand, will be willing to talk about some of this stuff, won't they?
I think that, but see again, and this is the kind of I'm much more comfortable on this terrain, I think, than the prognostications around Palestine. Is that you have when people say the UN, you could have some angry speeches by Russia in the Council, but the day-to-day work of the UN is really done by the Secretariat, right? They've already applied. They're going to have 150 jobs there, 50 national staff, and you'd think that would, on a day-to-day basis, the UN's operation in the field would be accountable to, or subject to the the whims and the complaints of all the members. But they really aren't. Once the horse leaves the barn, I'd say mostly, believe it or not, despite complaints in the U.S. that the UN is dominated by the enemies of the U.S. and Israel. Like, for example, the UN mission in Kosovo is totally on the Western side. I mean. For example, there's been this, and maybe it should be. I mean, the Kosovars were treated badly, etc. But Russia complains routinely in the Council that, Kosovo is taking over the border guards, Kosovo is dominating UNMIK, and nothing is done. So it's sort of like, I feel like with the Libya mission as well, when we say the UN, you can have some angry stakeouts by Ambassador Churkin. But the basic groove, and here's another thing, maybe this is a kind of racial bean counting, but the UN mission has now taken shape. The head of it is Ian Martin, who's a British guy, used to be with Amnesty International.
This is the UN mission to
Libya. It's UNSMEL, if you want to. UN support mission to Libya. The number 2 guy is George Charpentier, who's a Finn, who was in Sudan. I actually know him, and he was very close to Bashir and wasn't very critical of what they did there. And the number 3 post, the chief of staff, is a German guy. So, okay, I hear from Africans that work for the UN saying, like, how can you, Africans or Arabs? I mean, it just seems strange to create a mission that's so European top-heavy, right?
Yeah.
But,
well,
again, who did the bombing?
And the truth is, the United Nations was put together under the auspices of Franklin Roosevelt to some extent to serve the interests of powerful nations, of which the United States was one. Didn't Roosevelt even refer to the General Assembly as a place where kind of dinky nations can, quote, blow off steam? Isn't there that quote?
Yeah, I think there is that quote, and that is actually the reality.
Although it's interesting that with the Palestinian thing, we have a kind of exception to that. If the Palestinians had gone straight to the UN, and they may wind up, straight to the General Assembly, and they may wind up there, they could get something that I think most people agree, is something of some significance. It would be a significant elevation of stature and at least a mild affirmation of statehood that would have real consequence. And again, we're back to the fact that they chose not to go that route, and whether that won't wind up kind of largely negating this effort in the end, if they kind of never make it to the General Assembly for one reason or another.
Right. No, that is, I see that. Although I also see, really, and it seems like what the powerful countries are, and then I want to also distinguish this idea of power because Russia and China are both on the Security Council, and most of the things I read about the UN basically are kind of a cartoon version in which the UK, France, and the US want to do the right thing, and Russia and China are constantly doing the wrong thing. That pretty much is the Western coverage of it, and I'm not sure it's, and then. I'm not sure that's always the case, number one. And number two, I think absolutely, those three countries are more for rights, but I think you end up, there's some hypocrisy too. You have France and the UK trying to slim down, the peacekeeping mission in Abyei and Sudan just to save money. Mm-hmm. And you also have, you'd think and I'm starting, as I'm here longer, trying to figure out, when is it that for example, Russia complains all at once, but it can block Kosovo from joining the UN, but it really couldn't stop, despite its veto, the independence of Kosovo, the recognition by all these states, and the UN mission in the field being very closely aligned with Kosovo. Couldn't stop that, It just sort of happened. So it's kind of, I guess, and on the GA, what I'd say, even on Israel-Palestine, not just the U.S. argues, isn't it true that the real action on these really high-profile issues is not really in the UN? Certainly it's not in the General Assembly. Some of this theatrics, and today was a very high point for that. You had 100 and something countries standing up and applauding Abbas, and it felt sort of like this is it. This is like a popular referendum.
Yeah.
But what actual change it will make on the ground remains to not just remains to be seen.
Little. It has to do with the fact that, as I said, international law is in evolution. That alone will have little. Although it could psychologically affect the behavior of Palestinians and Israelis.
Sure.
I do think if they really wind up at the GA and get this thing, it will be non-trivial. But look, we'll see. I have to go to bed, and you okay. I guess will do what you do while the rest of the world sleeps. Which
there's a lot to process from the day, but it's been pretty good so far.
Yeah. So thank you as always for being our UN correspondent, Matthew. You're a role model for us all.
Okay. No, thanks a lot. I really like to do it more.
Yeah, me too. See you around.
Okay, see ya.
Bye-bye.